Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Winter cereal planting is coming to a close after excellent conditions all throughout the autumn this year. The overall area of planting is expected to be up this year, especially in winter oilseed rape and winter barley, both seeing large increases. There's quite a few crops that have been emerged for some weeks now, but there's also some farmers still planting the last of the crops after maize or root crops. The warm weather and the fact that some crops have been planted early is raising concerns among farmers and industry around the country as regards the level of aphids and the possibility of severe BYDV in crops this year. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Louise McNamara, an entomologist from Oak Park, who will chat about the threat posed by aphids this year. Louise, you're very welcome to the podcast. I just want to put a little bit of context on the problem in front of farmers this year as regards the potential damage that BYDV can inflict on different cereal crops. And also, you might just maybe consider the differences between the risks that farmers face in different parts of the country as well.
BYDV can affect any cereal because the aphids that vector it can live in any cereals or grasses. And the damage in cereals can be up to 80% yield loss with very severe infections. I suppose previous work by Chagas has shown that you can get major losses in grain, above 2 tons per hectare for wheat and oats, and up to 5 tons per hectare losses for winter barley. In terms of different parts of the country, different counties, we have trials from 2016 to 2019 done in Cork and Carlow, which has been analysed and showed that there was a significant difference in terms of yield and BYDV for different locations. And that makes sense, I suppose, because different locations may have different kind of climates, as in, say, Cork, where we had our site, was very close to the coast, and close to the coast may mean less frost and milder winters, which would mean more aphids and more BYDV.
So essentially what you're saying is the warmer you are, the warmer your area are that you live in, the chances are you're going to have a much higher risk.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, both the weather and the location can affect it in that way. Because the milder it is, the more chance aphids can survive over the winter, and also the more likely they are to be spreading virus and reproducing.
So with that in mind then, looking at the weather conditions over the last, I suppose 6 months, in Ireland, being quite mild and that probably poses a much bigger challenge this year than other years?
Yeah, so when we look at aphid monitoring, so we have a new suction tower network around the country. We have traps a trap in Carlow, Cork and Ashtown, and these are 12.2 metre traps. And what they do is they record the migratory aphids, so the long distance flight. And we only have a couple of years of data, so we couldn't yet say for sure how these numbers definitely affect BYDV and yield. But what we can see is that last year compared to this year in Carlow, the numbers of grain aphids were much higher this summer, around the time of the open day when we had temperatures above 20 degrees. There was a big burst in flight of aphids. So a lot higher numbers of grain aphids flying this year than last year in the summer. So it'll be interesting to see how that impacts then the disease pressure in the autumn. As I said, it's only 2 years of data, so we can't yet say for sure, but it'll be interesting to see how the temperature linked with the aphid numbers then affects disease pressure in the field. Okay,
so you have these flying aphids tripping around the place, whether they're 12 meters high or they're just coming from maybe a grassland field beside or even a margin beside the cereal crop. So when the aphid flies into the crop, is it that aphid that does the damage? And if so, how long does it take for that aphid to inflict that damage?
Okay, so firstly, when we talk about the different aphids that can cause damage in the cereal crops, you can get BYDV infection in two main ways. So you've got primary infection and secondary infection. And we talk about primary infection, that would be those individual aphids flying in or moving in, maybe from other fields or urban margins or things like that. So they're bringing in the infection initially. And then you have the secondary infection, which is when the aphids that are within the field start moving around, start feeding and continue to spread the virus. And secondary infection would be particularly important in those years or locations with mild conditions, because the period of time with those aphids can be spreading the virus is longer. Now, when you talk about how long does it take for an aphid to inflict the damage, so the acquisition, which is how it takes up the virus, and inoculation, which is how it spreads the virus into the crop, the amount of time that takes will vary between the different aphid species and then between the strain of virus they're spreading. But it could be, for example, for paddy, some studies have shown it only takes 15 minutes for it to take up the virus, and then it can start transmitting it within 15 minutes on the next crop. And then it will be different for different aphid species and for different strains. But we're talking, 15, 30 minutes up to, that would be like a certain proportion, and then up to, 2 hours there'd be more, 6 hours there'd be more.
So from the point of view then of the I suppose the total quantity of damage, can we say that the primary damage is more harmful than the secondary damage, or vice versa, or are they around equal?
In the milder winter, you'd be more worried about the secondary infection because it's that extended period of feeding and spreading virus. I suppose the challenge is at the start of the season, you don't know if you're going to have the year that's the primary infection, that's the worst. In a cold winter, it'll be the primary infection because it's whatever infection you get initially, because then the aphids will be killed off by, say, frost or snow or whatever and stop spreading virus. That's your, that'll be your primary infection is most important. Then in a mild winter where you don't get that frost killing off the aphids, the secondary infection may be more important. So it would depend on the year, and it's hard to know what start of the year which you're going to get.
Okay, so you have these aphids flying in, they're landing on the leaf, and they're sucking away on the sap out of the leaf, and they're causing infection. So there is natural predators out there. Is there any of those beneficials that can come in and, if you like, zap out the aphid before they do damage?
Okay, so you've got a range of natural enemies that would feed on aphids. So you've got things like ground beetles and spiders and parasitic wasps, and they'll be active in the autumn. But in the winter, it would have to be, for some of them, like parasitoids, you need to have a milder winter for that. I think the challenge is, there's a number of challenges with that. So yes, there's definitely beneficials that feed on aphids. The challenge is that whether the aphid has enough time to transmit the virus before it's attacked by the natural enemy is one thing. Even if it kills it, has it already spread the virus? Another thing is that the aphids may be reproducing faster than the natural enemies, and so it might be challenging for the natural enemies to keep the aphids at a lower level if they're breeding faster, because the aphids can clone themselves. So that's the challenge there.
So you're kind of saying they're good, but we can't overly rely on the miter.
I think the problem is because we've no thresholds we don't know the amount of aphids it takes to spread BYDV. So when you look at something like aphids on the ear, you've got a threshold in place. You know how many aphids per year can cause economically significant damage. So you can give the natural enemies a chance to, you'll often see mummies on the ear where the parasitoids have killed the aphids. So you're able to follow that along and see if your numbers are going up and going down and know where you're safe or not safe. The challenge with BYDV is we have no threshold in place, and we know that a small number of aphids can spread virus. So it will be challenging to know when your natural enemies are keeping it at the level you want. But certainly there's natural enemies that will feed on aphids. It's just about keeping them at a level that is good enough to prevent yield loss, and we don't know the level of aphids that is yet.
Okay, as with all these things, it's easy enough to look backwards, but looking forwards,
yes,
there's
a lot. It's quite complex. There's a lot happening at one time here.
Okay, so in this back end, we've had, I suppose, fantastic weather, really, and I suppose that's where that's playing into the aphids' hands a little bit. But I suppose as part of that, there's been very much an increased planting of cereals into a reduced tillage or a min-till type scenario, where you have more straw on the ground. I think I remember there was a bit of work done in Oak Park where the research was showing that had some sort of beneficial effect as regards BYDV or aphids.
Yeah, so Tom Kennedy has done a number of different studies on min-till versus conventional tillage for BYDV and the associated yield loss. So in one of the studies that was published in 2020, it looked at 3 different seasons. And in one of those seasons, so 2001, 2002, there was a significant difference from the BYDV in yield loss. And the grain yield in that year for min-till was better than conventional tillage due to the min-till having less BYDV than the conventional tillage. Then he did another study that looked at 2001 to 2006, but the improvement in grain yield relative to for min-till relative to conventional tillage was not significant in that study. So it was significant in some seasons, but not all seasons. So there's not a consistent message, but certainly there's patterns that the minimum tillage would have less aphids and less BYDV, the conventional tillage, but that didn't always translate in grain yield differences.
I suppose maybe we're talking about some of the beneficials. It's maybe going a little bit towards that way, and all the bits and pieces to help. But is it about beneficials, or is it about something else that the aphids don't like about Mintel?
So one element Tom Kennedy looked at was he also had a straw on the plots. So he had min-till versus conventional tillage with and without straw, and the ones with straw had a better effect. And the idea is that when an aphid is flying, when you don't have that contrast between soil and crop, it's harder for them to land and spread virus. So you might often see on the edge of plots or crops along the edge of tram lines and things like that, you get a bit more BYDV because the contrast between soil and crop is more stronger, so it's easier for them to see and to land. So the idea is, in min-till, where you might have more debris or straw or things on the ground, it might be harder for the aphids to land and then to spread virus. But it's just not consistent across years. But there is idea and suggestion that there's benefits there.
Sounds like that saying where where some people like to eat with their eyes. It kind of sounds a little bit like that, in fairness. Okay, so then the other issue, I suppose, that is out there, and I know we've talked about it before, and is that issue around resistance or insecticide resistance in some of the aphid populations. Has that changed, Louise, over the last couple of years? And do we have a handle on it, of where it is in 2021?
Yeah, so we have a number of projects looking at that. And I suppose our most recent data on that was testing the cereal aphid, so the grain aphid, in the suction tower samples. So it's the grain aphid, Cytobium avene, which is the aphid in Ireland that's been found to have partial resistance to pyrethroids, which people have often heard referred to as KDO or knockdown resistance. So in 2020, the aphids collected from the Old Park Tower and the Ashtown Tower were tested for this KDO resistance, partial resistance. And 22% of the grain aphids in Oak Park were found to be carrying the partial resistance, and 18% of the aphids in Ashtown were. But it's important to note that this is partial resistance, so they have one copy of the resistance gene. There's no sign yet of full resistance, but we are continuing to monitor for this.
And Louise, am I right in saying that is a bit lower than it was in the past, I think, is it?
Yeah, but not massively lower, but it certainly isn't going up anyway. I think previously it was around 25%, but they were in field testing, so testing colonies in the crops themselves. This is testing of migratory aphids, so flying aphids. But we've also done a study this year that tested 50 fields around the country to see what the level of resistance is like in the grain aphid populations, and we should have that then for the Tillage conference in January. So that'll be a nice update on what's happening on the ground as well as what's happening with the migratory aphids.
Okay, so given the year that's in it and everything we've said so far as regards aphids and the potentially the amount of aphids that are around this year, and we do talk about integrated pest management where farmers should do various different monitoring and bits and pieces. But given the year that's in it, is there any real point in a farmer doing any of that? Just go out and whack on an aphicide regardless anyway?
And well, I think it's always advisable to walk your crops and to look for pressure, because I suppose, as we were saying, that the disease pressure can vary with geographical location. So, for example, if you're planting later, but it's mild weather, you might want to know, are you getting that pressure anyway because you're in a high risk area, and maybe then you'll need a treatment. And why it's also important, I think, to walk the crops and look for those pests is if you've applied an insecticide and you want to be sure it's been effective, you need to walk the crops to see if you've had kill or not. So I still think it's advisable, even though we would consider, at the moment it looks like there's going to be pressure there. It does vary with field and it does vary with location. So it is important to know what's happening with your own crop.
And as you say as well, it's very important to get back out after you've applied as well, to see what the story is as well.
Yeah, see if you're satisfied with the control you got, exactly.
To do with the resistance. So I suppose getting on to the meat of it then, just in terms of, we have crops out there that were sown in the last week or so, or maybe last 2 weeks of September, all the way up to crops only being sown today. What sort of strategies, I suppose, general strategies are we recommending for farmers in terms of control of BYDV?
Yeah, so our advice that we're recommending is based on two sets of research. So Tom Kennedy's research in the past, and also our newer research that's been completed in the last number of years. And they both suggest the same advice, which is good, so it's consistent. So it's showing that where you plant early, which obviously isn't advisable, but is unavoidable in some situations, where you plant early, so like September, your crop is at higher risk because the aphids could still be flying and moving because the cold weather, hasn't arrived yet. So in that case, the crop may need 2 sprays. So one early spray at the 2 to 3 leaf stage, and then again in early November. If the crop wasn't planted till October, you should hold off till early November and do your single spray then. And then if the crop is emerging later, such as those emerging in November, it may not need a spray because the idea is that the temperatures drop then and aphids are less active. But again, that's why it's important to walk your crop to see if that's the case. If it's mild weather, are the aphids less active? Are you in a high risk area? Do you still have a lot of aphids active? So that's the general advice, but obviously it would be field dependent too.
So Louise, the early November date that you mentioned a couple of times, that's an indicative date in terms of that most years, one with the other, the level of aphids flying at that stage is pretty well stopped.
Yeah, so that's based on like a lot of previous research that suggests that on average the weather tends to drop and it's below the optimum temperature for aphid flight. So the idea is that when you get to early November, aphid flight should have been tailing off or should be ceased. So you're not having those aphids flying in to your crop. And that's the idea there of why we say November. But what our newer trials, so from 2016 to 2019, I think I mentioned before, we've done trials in Carlow and Cork looking at different treatments in winter barley. It did show that on average, if you don't get out in November, for maybe the ground conditions aren't acceptable or whatever, a spray in January is still effective. There was no significant difference between them. So when that mild conditions is there, if you didn't get out in November, it's still worth getting out in January. And that agrees with what Tom Kennedy showed in the past as well.
Okay. So Louise, we're after getting a huge amount of information there. The final question I just want to ask you is about there's a new insecticide out this year called Transform.
Mm-hmm.
And this can be used for the first time in the autumn this year. Maybe you might just give us an idea about whether any farmer actually needs to use it, because I think it is a bit more expensive. And if a farmer is going to use it, what's the best way to use it?
Yeah, so in the trials that I've mentioned, those trials in 2016 to 2019 in Carlow and Cork, we tested Transform alongside pyrethroids and neonicotinoid seed treatments. Obviously, we don't have the neonicotinoid seed treatments anymore, but it was good to compare the efficacy of the newer chemicals and pyrethroids to the seed treatment, which people were quite satisfied with the control they were getting from the seed treatments. So we found that, Transform works as well as pyrethroids and as well as seed treatments. There's no significant difference between the control given by any of the chemistries. So that would say to us that when a farmer needs to apply 2 insecticides, so in those really early planted crops, it would be good maybe to alternate chemistries from a resistance management perspective, because pyrethroids and Transform are a different type of chemistry. So it can be good to alternate your chemistries to help protect them. Another thing is, I think that Transform can't be used until November, I'm pretty sure, based on the label. So if you're needing 2, you could go out with your pyrethroids first and maybe follow with your Transform. And then if you only need 1 chemistry because you planted maybe in October, you could use either. They both would give, in general, give good enough control.
Okay, so it's a useful tool in the toolbox, if you like, but not to be all and end all tool.
No, it's always good to have. It's always good to have additional options, so that you're not relying on one and putting pressure on that chemistry. But it's important to note that doesn't mean we should go doing extra spraying. It's still the same number of sprays is sufficient, and it's just which chemistry you choose to go with. And if you need more than one, you can alternate them.
Okay. Louise, that's brilliant. That's a huge amount of information in that. And I think if people might have to go back and listen to this podcast a second time to kind of get all the nuggets that are in there. Thank you very much for your time, Louise. We'll certainly come back to you again because I think you have an awful lot of very exciting research that's going to be hitting the streets hopefully in the next couple of years. So we'll chat to you again. Thanks, Louise.
Perfect. Thanks a million.
So that's it for the Tillage Edge, and my thanks to Louise for joining me on the podcast. Don't forget, if you like this podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.